Hey there! How's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. I want you to think about something for a moment. Right now, in this very instant, fire is working for you in ways you probably haven't even considered. The electricity flowing through whatever device you're listening to this on, that's fire transformed. The warmth keeping you comfortable, fire's gentle touch. Even those calories from your last meal that are fueling your brain as you listen to these words. Yep, that's fire too. Doing its ancient work inside your cells. But here's what's going to absolutely blow your mind, and I mean this literally. For 99.9% of Earth's entire history, there was no fire on the surface at all. None. Zero. Zilch. Can you wrap your head around that? Our beautiful blue planet, born in cosmic flames 4.5 billion years ago, slowly cooled into this world of endless oceans and silent stone where fire simply couldn't exist. For billions of years, Earth was a wet rock spinning through space, and fire was as foreign to its surface as life itself. Think about that for a second. This force that now powers our entire civilization, that heats our homes and runs our cities and launches us to the stars, it was completely absent from our planet for longer than we can truly comprehend. Earth had volcanoes, sure, but that's different. That's the planet's molten heart bleeding through. What I'm talking about is real fire, the dancing flames that consume and transform and create. So what changed? What flipped the switch and brought fire to a world that had never known it? The answer lies in a cave in South Africa called Wonderwerk. Now I know what you're thinking. Another cave, another archaeological site with a hard-to-pronounce name. But stick with me here, because what happened in Wonderwerk Cave 1 million years ago was quite possibly the most important moment in the history of life on Earth. Picture this. One of our ancestors, maybe Homo erectus or perhaps an earlier relative, is doing something that no creature in the 4.5 billion year history of our planet had ever done before. They're not running from fire. They're reaching toward it. Can you imagine that moment? The raw courage, or maybe it was desperation, or perhaps just burning curiosity, literally burning curiosity, that it took to extend a hand toward flame. Every instinct, every millions-year-old survival mechanism, screaming at them to flee. Fire meant death. Fire meant destruction. Fire meant run, but they didn't run. They reached out, and in that single gesture, in that one outstretched hand grasping a burning stick, lay the seeds of absolutely everything we would ever become. Cities that stretch to the horizon, civilizations that span continents, ships that carry us across oceans and rockets that launch us to other worlds, art that moves us to tears and music that lifts our souls, medicine that heals and technology that connects us across vast distances, all of it. Every single bit of human achievement you can think of started with someone brave enough, or cold enough, or curious enough to pick up a burning branch. Now here's where this gets really wild. We know fire existed before this moment, of course. Lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, the friction of wind-blown branches. Nature has always made fire. But for the first time in Earth's history, a living creature looked at fire and thought, I'm taking this with me. The archaeological evidence at Wonderwerk is mind-blowing when you really dig into it. We're talking about burnt bones and ash deposits that are clearly not from natural wildfires. These fires were contained, controlled, maintained. Someone was feeding them. Someone was keeping them alive. But here's the crazy part, and this is where it gets really fascinating. They weren't making fire yet. They were fire thieves, fire shepherds, fire nursemaids. When lightning struck and set the grasslands ablaze, our ancestors learned to capture those flames like catching lightning bugs, carrying glowing embers from place to place, nurturing them like precious babies. Imagine the responsibility. Imagine being the person in your group whose job it was to keep the fire alive. If you let it die, if you got careless with the embers, if rain extinguished your flame, your family, your friends, everyone you loved would be plunged back into cold darkness, waiting for who knows how long until lightning decided to strike again. The pressure must have been enormous. You're literally carrying the difference between life and death in your hands. Drop those embers, let them get too wet, fail to feed them enough fuel, and boom, back to the dark ages. Literally. And yet they did it. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors carried fire from place to place like a sacred torch, passing it from generation to generation, never letting it die. Think about that dedication. Think about that commitment to something they probably didn't even fully understand. Because here's what's really remarkable. They couldn't have known what fire would eventually make possible. They couldn't have imagined that this flickering orange force would one day power steam engines and light up cities and take us to the moon. They just knew it was warm. They knew it kept the scary things away in the darkness. They knew food tasted different, better, when you held it near the flames. But the universe had much bigger plans for fire than our ancestors could have ever dreamed. You see, fire wasn't just going to warm their bodies or cook their food. Fire was about to completely rebuild them. Not just their tools, not just their way of life. Fire was going to rewire their biology, reshape their bodies, and fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. Their brains were about to explode in size. Their digestive systems were going to shrink. Their social structures were going to become incredibly complex. Their ability to communicate was going to develop into full language, then writing, then literature and poetry and philosophy. Fire was going to turn them into us, but they didn't know any of that yet. In that cave in South Africa 1 million years ago, they just knew they had captured something powerful and mysterious and useful. They had stolen fire from the gods, so to speak. Though they probably didn't think of it in those terms, what they had really done, though they couldn't possibly have understood it at the time, was set in motion the most incredible transformation. In the history of life on Earth, they had lit the fuse on human civilization. And here's the thing that just absolutely amazes me. We can trace it all back to that moment. Every smartphone, every skyscraper, every symphony, every scientific discovery, every work of art that has ever moved you, it all connects back to someone in a cave deciding to reach toward flame instead of running away from it. It's like the ultimate butterfly effect. Except instead of a butterfly wing causing a hurricane, it's a reaching hand causing the entire modern world. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Fire seems so basic, so primitive. We've moved beyond fire, right? We have electricity. We have nuclear power, we have solar panels and wind turbines. Fire is something we do when we're camping or having a romantic dinner, but that's where you'd be wrong. Fire is still everywhere in our lives, just disguised. That electricity I mentioned, most of it still comes from burning something: coal, natural gas, oil. Your car engine, controlled explosions of gasoline. Even your own body is running on a kind of slow-burning fire, metabolically speaking, consuming fuel and releasing energy. Fire never went away. It just got more sophisticated. And that sophistication started 1 million years ago in a cave in South Africa, with someone who looked at humanity's greatest fear and decided to make it humanity's greatest friend. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we can really understand how revolutionary that moment was, we need to understand what life was like before fire. We need to picture a world where darkness truly meant death, where the setting sun brought terror instead of peace, where our ancestors spent their nights huddled together in absolute blackness. Surrounded by glowing eyes and hungry growls, we need to understand just how desperate, how vulnerable, how utterly at the mercy of nature our ancestors were before they learned to carry flame, because only then can we truly appreciate the magnitude of what happened when one brave soul decided to reach toward the light instead of running into the darkness. And trust me, when you hear what life was like before fire, you're going to have a whole new appreciation for that flickering candle on your dinner table. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine true darkness. Not the kind of darkness you experience in your bedroom at night, where there's always some light leaking in from somewhere. A digital clock, streetlights through the curtains, the faint glow of your phone. I'm talking about absolute complete pitch-black darkness. Now imagine that when the sun goes down, that darkness doesn't just mean bedtime. It means death could be lurking 3 feet away and you'd never see it coming. Welcome to Earth before fire, a planet where sunset was literally a matter of life and death. Picture our ancestors huddled together as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. The temperature drops 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees. The familiar sounds of day, birds chirping, insects buzzing, give way to something much more sinister. Rustling in the bushes, heavy breathing, the soft padding of massive paws on ancient soil, and those eyes. Oh, those glowing eyes reflecting starlight in the darkness. Saber-toothed cats with fangs longer than your fingers, prowling silently through the night. Cave bears. And I need you to understand just how massive these things were, 3 times the size of the biggest grizzly bears you can imagine today. We're talking about 800-pound killing machines with claws like daggers, and no fear whatsoever of humans. But wait, it gets worse. Packs of massive hyenas, not the scavenging opportunists we know today, but active predators the size of lions, hunting in coordinated groups with bone-crushing jaws that could snap a human femur like a toothpick. And our ancestors, they had absolutely nothing to fight back with, except each other. No fire to keep predators at bay, no light to see danger coming, no heat to ward off the killing cold. Just body warmth shared between frightened groups of early humans, pressed together in caves or under rock overhangs, hoping desperately that whatever was making those sounds in the darkness would find easier prey somewhere else. Now here's what's really fascinating, and this is where the science gets incredible. We can actually see what this constant terror did to our ancestors' bodies. At a site called Dmanisi in Georgia, archaeologists have found skulls from 1.8 million years ago that tell an amazing story about pre-fire human life. Their jaws were enormous. I'm not exaggerating here. We're talking about molars the size of ice cubes. Jaw muscles so powerful they could crack open bones like we crack walnuts. These weren't the refined, delicate faces we see in humans today. These were heavy-duty food processors built for survival. Because, here's the thing, nobody really talks about when discussing early human life. Without fire to cook food, our ancestors spent up to 6 hours every single day just chewing. 6 hours. That's longer than most people spend at work today, and our ancestors were doing it just to get enough nutrition to survive. Imagine trying to chew through raw meat that's tough as leather, grinding away at fibrous roots and tubers that are harder than carrots. Your jaw muscles working constantly, getting bigger and stronger, reshaping your entire skull to accommodate the massive forces needed to process raw food. And that was just during the day. When darkness fell, the real terror began. Without fire, early humans had to develop entirely different survival strategies. They became experts at reading the landscape, finding caves and rock shelters that could be defended. They learned to recognize the signs of predator presence, scratch marks on trees, the distinctive odor of big cat urine, the scattered bones of previous kills. But here's what really gets me. They had to learn to sleep differently too. We have evidence that pre-fire humans likely practiced what scientists call polyphasic sleep. Instead of sleeping through the night like we do, they would take short naps throughout the 24-hour cycle, never staying unconscious for too long because that meant death. Think about that for a second. They literally couldn't afford to sleep deeply. Every few hours, someone had to wake up and listen, check for danger, make sure the group was still safe, then maybe catch another hour or two of restless sleep before starting the cycle again. The cold was its own kind of enemy. Without fire, humans were completely at the mercy of weather. When temperatures dropped, they had only their own body heat and whatever animal skins they could scavenge. Archaeological evidence shows us that our ancestors developed incredible group bonding behaviors, what scientists playfully call primate cuddle. Puddles, where entire groups would sleep pressed together for warmth. These weren't just survival tactics. They were the foundation of human social behavior. Those cuddle puddles taught our ancestors that cooperation meant survival, trust meant warmth, Looking out for others meant everyone lived to see another day. But here's where it gets really interesting. Life had already figured out some amazing solutions to the problems our ancestors faced. All around them, other creatures were thriving in the cold and dark, using strategies that seem almost magical to us today. Deep in the oceans, fish and squid had evolved bioluminescence, the ability to create their own light through chemical reactions. They were literally living flashlights, carrying their own illumination wherever they went. Arctic fish had developed antifreeze proteins in their blood, allowing them to swim in water that should have turned them into ice cubes. Some mammals had learned to drop their body temperature to near freezing during winter, slipping into states of suspended animation that let them survive months without food. Bears were becoming hibernation experts, slowing their metabolism to almost nothing and living off stored fat until spring returned. But our ancestors, they had no antifreeze proteins, no bioluminescence, no ability to hibernate. They had only their intelligence, their social bonds, and their remarkable ability to work together. And yet, in this world of teeth and terror, something incredible was happening. These desperate survival strategies were actually preparing humanity for something extraordinary. Those massive jaw muscles that developed from chewing tough food were building the foundation for complex facial expressions. The social bonding required for survival was developing the emotional intelligence that would later allow for sophisticated communication. The constant vigilance needed to survive the night was sharpening their senses and their ability to read environmental cues. The cooperation required to share body warmth was teaching them that working together could overcome individual weaknesses. Without knowing it, life before fire was building the psychological and social tools that would make controlling fire possible. Our ancestors were learning patience, keeping watch through long, terrifying nights. They were learning trust. Your life literally depended on the person next to you staying alert during their watch. They were learning to communicate without words, a grunt or gesture that could warn of danger without alerting predators. But perhaps most importantly, they were learning to be curious about their environment instead of just afraid of it. When you're spending every day searching for food and shelter, you start to notice patterns. Which plants are safe to eat? Which animal tracks mean danger? What does the sky look like before a storm? This curiosity would prove crucial when they finally encountered fire. Instead of just running in terror like every other animal, some of our ancestors had developed the mental flexibility to wonder, what is this strange, bright, warm thing? Could it be useful? The archaeological record shows us something beautiful happening during this period. Even in their desperate struggle for survival, our ancestors were beginning to create. At sites across Africa, we find evidence of early tool-making, simple but effective weapons and cutting implements that show planning and forethought. They were beginning to modify their environment instead of just adapting to it. A sharp stone tied to a stick created a spear. A carefully selected rock became a hammer. They were taking the raw materials of nature and reshaping them to serve human needs. This was the first technology, born from necessity but requiring imagination. And it was preparing them for the moment when they would encounter something that would change everything, not just their tools, but their very bodies and minds, because somewhere out there in the vast African landscape, lightning was beginning to strike dry grass. Wildfires were starting to sweep across the savannas, and for the first time in Earth's history, some of those fires were going to be met not with fleeing animals, but with curious, intelligent creatures brave enough to investigate. The stage was set for the most important encounter in human history. Our ancestors had survived the darkness, endured the cold, and developed the social and mental tools they would need for what came next. They were about to meet fire, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Rift Valley of East Africa, 1.5 million years ago. The air is thick with humidity, and storm clouds are building on the horizon like dark mountains in the sky. Our ancestors can feel it coming, that electric tension that makes your skin prickle and the hair on your arms stand up. Then it happens. Lightning splits the sky with a crack that seems to tear the world in half. The bolt strikes dry grassland with the force of a cosmic hammer, and within minutes, flames are racing across the savannah like liquid sunlight. The fire moves fast, crackling and roaring as it devours everything in its path. Smoke billows into the sky, visible for miles in every direction, and every single animal, every antelope, every bird, every insect, every creature with the sense to fear destruction, flees in absolute terror, every animal except one. Picture this moment, because it's quite possibly the most important scene in human history. While zebras stampede and birds take flight, while even the mighty elephants turn and lumber away from the advancing flames, a small group of early humans, maybe Homo erectus, maybe an even earlier ancestor, does something that has never happened before in the 4.5 billion year history of life on Earth. They don't run, one of them. Maybe driven by curiosity, maybe by desperation, maybe by a kind of intelligence that's just beginning to flower in the human brain, approaches the fire as it begins to die down. Can you imagine that first step? Every instinct screaming danger, every survival mechanism built over millions of years of evolution yelling flee, and yet they move closer. What was going through their mind in that moment? We'll never know for certain, but we can imagine the overwhelming sensory experience. The heat on their face, so different from the sun's warmth, more immediate, more alive somehow. The mesmerizing dance of orange and yellow flames that seems to move with purpose, like it's trying to communicate something. The sound, not the roar of the massive wildfire, but the gentle crackling and popping of dying embers, almost like whispered conversation. And the smell, wood smoke mixed with burned grass, creating an entirely new scent that no creature on Earth had ever experienced before. But here's what really gets me about this moment. It wasn't just about overcoming fear. It was about recognizing opportunity. While every other animal saw destruction, this ancestor of ours saw something else entirely. They saw warmth that didn't depend on the sun, light that could push back the darkness, power that could be useful. Now, we know this happened because of the archaeological evidence, and let me tell you, it's absolutely mind-blowing when you really understand what we're looking at. At a site called Chesawanja in Kenya, researchers have found burnt clay and animal bones that date back 1.4 million years. But here's the crucial detail. This wasn't evidence of a natural wildfire. The burn patterns, the way the bones were fractured, the arrangement of the ash deposits, it all points to something incredible. Controlled fire. Maintained fire. Fire that was being fed and tended and kept alive by intelligent hands. For the first time in Earth's history, a living creature was playing with the forces of creation and destruction. They were fire shepherds, fire thieves, fire nursemaids, stealing flames from nature's accidents and carrying them away like precious treasures. But, and this is crucial to understand, they weren't making fire yet. That breakthrough was still hundreds of thousands of years in the future. What they were doing was even more remarkable in some ways. They were learning to maintain fire, to keep it alive, to understand its needs and moods. Think about the learning curve involved here. Fire is hungry, it needs constant feeding. Fire is thirsty, too much water kills it instantly. Fire is social, it spreads from fuel to fuel, but only under the right conditions. Fire is temperamental. Wind can make it rage out of control or snuff it out entirely. Our ancestors had to learn all of this through trial and error, with no instruction manual, no teacher except bitter experience. How many times did they let their precious fire die out? How many times did they wake up to cold ashes and the terrifying prospect of waiting who knows how long until lightning struck again? Imagine being the person responsible for keeping the fire alive. The weight of that responsibility must have been crushing. Your family's warmth, their safety from night predators, their ability to make food more digestible. All of it depended on your skill at nurturing a few glowing embers. Let your attention wander for too long. Let the fuel burn too low, fail to protect the coals from a sudden rainstorm. And boom, You've plunged your entire group back into the Dark Ages, literally, and yet they learned. The evidence shows us that our ancestors became incredibly sophisticated fire maintainers. They learned to carry coals in specially prepared containers, maybe large shells or hollowed-out bones packed with tinder. They learned to read smoke patterns to judge wind direction. They discovered that different materials burned differently. Dry grass for quick flames, hardwood for long-lasting coals. At Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, remember that place from our first chapter? Archaeologists have found evidence of fire use stretching back an incredible 1 million years. But what's really fascinating is how that evidence changes over time. The earliest fires are small, tentative, clearly experimental. But as you move forward through the archaeological layers, the fires become more sophisticated, more controlled, more purposeful. They were learning, generation by generation, how to be partners with fire instead of just afraid of it. But here's where this story gets really wild. Our ancestors weren't just maintaining fire, they were beginning to understand its power to transform things. Those burned bones at Chesawanja weren't just accidentally charred. They show clear evidence of intentional cooking, of deliberately applying fire to food to change its properties. This was the beginning of chemistry, though they had no word for it. They were discovering that fire plus meat equals something softer, more flavorful, easier to digest. Fire plus certain stones equals different colored rocks that might be useful. Fire plus wood equals light, heat, and protection from predators. They were becoming scientists, conducting experiments that would have consequences. They couldn't possibly imagine, because here's what our fire-tending ancestors couldn't have known. Every moment they spent around those flames was changing them. Not just their culture, not just their survival strategies, but their actual bodies. The proteins they were starting to cook were releasing more calories than raw food ever could. Their digestive systems were beginning to adapt to this new, easier-to-process nutrition, and most importantly, their brains were getting more fuel than any primate brain had ever received before. The transformation had begun, though it would take hundreds of thousands of years to fully unfold. But in those fire-lit circles, as our ancestors fed flames and shared cooked food and experienced artificial light for the first time, they were taking the first steps toward becoming us. They were also discovering something else that would prove crucial to human development, the power of the shared experience. Fire created gathering places around those flickering flames. Groups that had previously scattered at sunset now stayed together through the night. They watched the flames dance, felt the warmth on their faces, and for the first time in human history, they had time to just be together. No immediate survival pressures, no need to keep moving to find food or shelter. Just humans sitting around fire, beginning to notice things about each other and their world that they'd never had time to observe before. This was where language truly began to develop. Not the simple warning calls and basic communications they'd always used, but complex sharing of experiences, ideas, observations. The fire gave them light to see each other's faces, revealing subtle expressions and emotions. It gave them a central focus point that encouraged group cohesion. Most importantly, it gave them time to think, time to wonder, time to imagine possibilities beyond just surviving until tomorrow. And in that time, in those fire-lit gatherings, the seeds of everything we would become were being planted. Art, music, storytelling, philosophy, science, all of it began in those circles of light pushed against the darkness. But they couldn't have known any of that. To them, fire was simply this amazing tool that made life better in immediate, practical ways. It kept them warm. It scared away the things that wanted to eat them. It made food taste different, and somehow more satisfying. They had no idea they were lighting the fuse on a transformation that would eventually take their descendants to the moon and beyond. All they knew was that they had captured something powerful and useful, and they were going to hold on to it no matter what. Through rain and wind, through seasons of plenty and times of scarcity, through migrations across continents and the rise and fall of countless generations, fire had found its partners on Earth, and those partners were about to become something unprecedented in the history of life itself. Here's something that's going to absolutely blow your mind. When Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham decided to investigate the difference between raw and cooked food, he discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about human evolution. Cooking increases the available calories in food by up to 80%. 80%. Think about that for a moment. That's not just a minor improvement. That's like discovering a completely new food source. Overnight, our fire-wielding ancestors suddenly had access to massive amounts of energy that had been locked away in their raw diet for millions of years. But here's where it gets really crazy. The human body, like any efficient system, doesn't waste resources. When our ancestors suddenly had access to all this extra nutrition, their bodies said, well, if we're getting more bang for our buck with food, maybe we don't need such enormous, energy-hungry digestive systems anymore. And that's exactly what happened. Within just 300,000 years of learning to control fire, which is lightning fast in evolutionary terms, something extraordinary occurred. Our ancestors' guts shrank by 20%, while their brains nearly doubled in size. Let me say that again, because it's so incredible it bears repeating. Their stomachs got smaller, and their brains got bigger. Fire literally rewired human biology from the inside out, but the transformation didn't stop there. Oh no, we're just getting started. You see, when you change one major system in the body, everything else has to adapt. It's like pulling on a thread and watching an entire sweater unravel, except in this case, it was rebuilding itself into something completely new. Smaller digestive systems meant less energy devoted to processing food. That energy had to go somewhere, and the human body decided to invest it in brain power. More neurons, more complex neural networks, more sophisticated thinking abilities. Our ancestors were literally eating their way to intelligence, and here's where the changes start cascading through their bodies like dominoes falling in slow motion. All that extra brain power required a different kind of skull to house it. Skulls started expanding upward and outward. But you can't just make heads bigger without changing everything else. Bigger brains meant different birthing requirements. Human babies started being born earlier in their development compared to other primates, when their heads were still small enough to fit through the birth canal. This meant longer childhoods, more time for learning, more opportunity for cultural transmission between generations. But wait, there's more. Remember those massive jaw muscles we talked about in the last chapter? The ones needed for chewing tough raw food for 6 hours a day? Well, cooked food is soft. It's easy to chew. Those enormous jaw muscles weren't needed anymore, and when jaw muscles shrink, the whole architecture of the face changes. Smaller jaws meant smaller teeth. Smaller teeth meant less prominent brows. Less prominent brows meant flatter faces. Flatter faces meant more room for brain expansion and more refined facial expressions. Are you starting to see the picture? Fire wasn't just cooking food, it was cooking human beings into an entirely new kind of creature. The changes went deeper than just physical structure. Fire was rewiring human behavior in ways that would prove just as important as the biological transformations. Before fire, remember, our ancestors slept in those short, vigilant bursts I mentioned earlier, polyphasic sleep patterns designed to keep them alive through dangerous nights. But with protective flames keeping predators at bay, something remarkable happened to human sleep. They started sleeping longer, deeper, more restoratively. Instead of catching quick naps between danger checks, they could afford to slip into the deep sleep stages that are crucial for memory consolidation, brain development, and physical repair. This change in sleep patterns had enormous consequences for cognitive development. Deep sleep is when the brain processes the day's experiences, consolidates memories, and literally cleans out metabolic waste products that build up during waking hours. Our fire-protected ancestors were getting higher quality rest than any primate had ever experienced. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in those firelit circles themselves. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, A species was gathering regularly in artificial light, with time to simply observe each other without the pressure of immediate survival tasks. This is where language exploded from simple communication into something genuinely complex. Around those dancing flames, our ancestors could see facial expressions in detail. They could observe subtle gestures and body language. They had leisure time to experiment with sounds, to play with communication, to develop the sophisticated grammar and vocabulary that would eventually become human language. The fire created the world's first theaters, the first classrooms, the first social clubs. Stories began to develop, not just practical information about where to find food or how to avoid danger, but complex narratives that entertained, that explored possibilities, that shared experiences and emotions. Think about this for a second. Storytelling, the foundation of all human culture, all literature, all art, began around fires. Those flickering flames created moving shadows on cave walls, natural puppet shows that may have inspired the first visual narratives. The rhythm of crackling wood and glowing coals provided the beat for the first music. And here's something that just amazes me. The fire itself became a character in these early stories. Every culture on Earth has fire myths, fire gods, stories about how humans got fire and what it means. Fire didn't just change how we lived. It changed how we thought about ourselves and our place in the universe. But let's get back to the biology for a moment, because the transformation was far from over. All these changes, the brain expansion, the jaw reduction, the sleep improvements, they were feeding back on each other, accelerating the pace of human evolution in ways that had never happened before in the history of life. Better nutrition led to bigger brains. Bigger brains led to more sophisticated fire use. More sophisticated fire use led to even better nutrition. It was a feedback loop that sent human development into overdrive. The archaeological record shows us just how fast this was happening. Tools became more sophisticated almost overnight in evolutionary terms. Art appeared, cave paintings, carved figurines, decorative objects that served no survival purpose except to please the human eye and imagination. But here's what really gets me about this transformation. It wasn't just happening to individuals. It was happening to the entire species, and the knowledge was being passed down through those firelit gatherings in ways that had never been possible before. Before fire, when an individual learned something useful, let's say a new technique for making tools, that knowledge died with them unless they could somehow demonstrate it to others during the brief social interactions available between survival tasks. But around fires, with time and light and social cohesion, complex knowledge could be shared, refined, and passed to the next generation. This was the birth of cumulative culture, the ability for each generation to build on the knowledge of the previous one instead of starting from scratch. It's what separates humans from every other species on Earth. Individual animals can be incredibly intelligent, but only humans can accumulate knowledge across generations. And it all started around fires. The changes kept cascading. Fire-hardened spear points made hunting more effective. More effective hunting meant better nutrition for pregnant mothers and growing children. Better childhood nutrition meant even more brain development. More brain development meant better fire management and tool-making skills. Round and round it went, each improvement enabling the next, each generation slightly more capable than the last. All of it spiraling upward towards something unprecedented in the history of life. But our ancestors still had no idea where this was all leading. They couldn't have imagined that their great-great-grandchildren would be using fire to smelt metals, that their descendants would power ships across oceans and send messages instantly across continents. They just knew that life around fire was better than life without it. Warmer, safer, more social, more interesting. The food tasted better, the nights were less terrifying, and somehow, in ways they couldn't quite articulate, they felt more human. Because that's exactly what was happening. For the first time in the 4.5 billion-year history of Earth, a species was evolving, not just biologically, but culturally and technologically. They were becoming something new, not just another animal struggling to survive, but conscious creators capable of reshaping their environment to serve their needs. Fire had lit the fuse on human consciousness itself, and the explosion was just beginning. Picture this. 400,000 years ago at Kesem Cave in Israel, something extraordinary is happening. For the first time in human history, someone is building what we would recognize as a kitchen, not just a random fire pit where people gathered when they happened to catch some flames from a wildfire. We're talking about a dedicated hearth, a carefully constructed fire space with stone borders, draft control, and even what appear to be specific areas for different cooking activities. This is the moment when humans stopped being fire followers and became fire masters. But how did we make that incredible leap from carrying around stolen embers to actually creating fire on demand? The answer lies in one of humanity's greatest discoveries: friction. Somewhere, somehow, one of our ancestors noticed that rubbing two sticks together really vigorously made them hot. Really hot. Hot enough to create a tiny glowing ember that could be coaxed into flame with the right kind of tinder and a lot of very careful breathing. Can you imagine that first successful attempt? Hours of patient rubbing, your hands raw and bleeding, your arms aching, probably feeling like you're chasing an impossible dream. And then a wisp of smoke, a tiny red glow, and with the gentlest breath, the most careful feeding of dry grass and bark. Fire that you made. Fire that didn't depend on lightning or volcanic eruptions or lucky encounters with wildfires. Fire that you could create whenever and wherever you needed it. The techniques they developed were absolutely ingenious. The hand drill, a straight stick rotated rapidly between the palms against a flat piece of wood until friction created enough heat to ignite tinder. The fire plow, dragging a hardwood stick along a groove in softwood until the accumulated wood dust caught fire. And eventually, the bow drill, using a bow-shaped tool to spin the fire stick much faster than hands alone could manage, generating enough heat to create fire in minutes instead of hours. Each technique was a masterpiece of physics and engineering, developed by people who had no formal understanding of thermodynamics or combustion chemistry. They were working purely through observation, experimentation, and thousands of years of trial and error, and once they mastered fire creation, everything accelerated. At Kesem Cave, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated fire management that would make modern campers jealous. These ancient humans had figured out that different woods burn differently. Oak provided long-lasting coals, perfect for overnight heating. Pine created quick, hot flames, ideal for searing meat. Cedar produced aromatic smoke that kept insects away and may have been used for preserving food. They were becoming fire chemists, understanding on an intuitive level how different materials interacted with flame. They discovered that certain stones could withstand repeated heating and cooling, perfect for lining fire pits. Other stones would crack or explode when heated, dangerous knowledge that had to be learned the hard way. But here's where it gets really exciting. Fire wasn't just about warmth and cooking anymore. It was becoming technology's gateway drug. Those fire-hardened spear points I mentioned. Game changers, literally. Before fire hardening, wooden spears were useful for small game and maybe wounded animals, but they couldn't penetrate the thick hide of healthy large prey. Fire-hardened points were sharp enough and strong enough to bring down mammoths. Can you imagine the confidence, the planning, the sheer audacity required to hunt an animal that weighs 6 tons using nothing but fire-sharpened sticks? But our ancestors were doing exactly that, and the archaeological evidence proves it. Fire was also revolutionizing food preparation in ways that went far beyond simple cooking. Heated stones could be dropped into leather bags filled with water, creating the world's first soups and stews. This wasn't just about taste, it was about extracting maximum nutrition from bones, tough plant materials, and organ meats that were difficult to process any other way. They discovered that certain plants became not just edible, but actively beneficial when cooked. Raw cassava is toxic, but cooking neutralizes the poison and provides crucial carbohydrates. Acorns are bitter and indigestible raw, but roasting and grinding them creates nutritious flour. Fire was teaching humans to see potential in their environment that other animals completely missed. A bitter root that made you sick could become sustaining food with the right application of heat. A hard stick could become a deadly weapon with patient exposure to flame. And then, about 30,000 years ago, humans made another leap that changed everything. They discovered that fire plus clay equals pottery. This might not sound revolutionary to you. After all, clay pots are pretty basic technology by today's standards. But think about what pottery represented. For the first time, humans were transforming raw materials into entirely new substances with completely different properties. Clay is soft, moldable, fragile when dry. But expose it to fire at the right temperature for the right amount of time, and it becomes hard, waterproof, permanent. This was chemistry in action. Though our ancestors had no word for it, pottery enabled food storage on a scale never before possible. Instead of eating everything immediately or watching it spoil, humans could now preserve surplus food for lean times. This led to the first permanent settlements, the first population growth beyond what the immediate environment could support, the first true step toward civilization. But we're still not done with fire's revolutionary impact. Because around 7,000 years ago, in the mountains of Serbia, the Vinča culture made a discovery that would reshape the world. Metallurgy. They figured out that certain shiny rocks, copper ore, would melt in a really hot fire and could be shaped into tools and ornaments. This was humanity's introduction to the Bronze Age. Though bronze itself wouldn't be perfected for another 1,000 years, the progression from that first melted copper to the complex metallurgy that built empires is absolutely mind-blowing. Each metal required precise temperature control that pushed fire management to new levels of sophistication. Copper melts at 1,084 degrees Celsius. Bronze requires mixing copper and tin at even higher temperatures. Iron smelting demands temperatures of 1,500 degrees Celsius or more. Each advancement required better furnaces, better fuel, better understanding of combustion science. But here's what really amazes me. Our ancestors figured all this out through pure experimentation. No textbooks, no internet tutorials, no scientific instruments. Just careful observation of how different materials behaved in fire, passed down through generations of metalworkers who gradually refined and perfected their techniques. The cascade of innovation was breathtaking. Bronze tools were harder and more durable than stone, enabling better agriculture, more sophisticated construction, deadlier weapons. Iron was even better, cheaper to produce and harder than bronze, democratizing metal tools and transforming entire societies. By the time the Romans perfected concrete using lime kilns, another fire-based technology, humans had gone from stealing flames from wildfires to building massive engineering projects that required precise control of combustion chemistry. Roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, entire cities, all made possible by humanity's mastery of fire. The Pantheon in Rome, with its massive concrete dome, still stands today as a testament to what fire-powered technology could achieve 2,000 years ago. But perhaps the most incredible thing about this whole progression is how each innovation opened doors to possibilities that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. The person who first hardened a spear point in fire had no idea they were starting down a path that would lead to skyscrapers and spacecraft. The potter who first baked clay into ceramic couldn't have dreamed that they were laying the foundation for computer chips and fiber optic cables, both technologies that depend on precisely controlled, high-temperature manufacturing processes. Fire had become more than just a tool. It had become the engine of human progress itself. Every major technological advancement in human history has involved either harnessing fire's power or controlling its effects. And we were just getting started. Because fire was about to enable the greatest transformation in human history, the birth of civilization itself, with all its wonders and complexities and contradictions. But first, I want you to imagine something with me. What if that first ancestor had made a different choice? What if, instead of reaching toward the flame, they had turned and run like every other animal? What would our world look like if fire had remained wild and untamed, forever beyond human reach? The answer is both fascinating and terrifying, and it's a story worth telling. Let's take a journey to a world that never was. A world where that crucial moment in the Rift Valley played out differently. Where lightning struck the grassland, flames raced across the savannah, and our ancestor, faced with humanity's first encounter with fire, made the same choice as every other animal that had ever lived. They ran. In this alternate timeline, fire remains forever wild, forever beyond human control. And the consequences of that single different decision ripple through millions of years, creating a version of Earth so alien to our experience that it's almost impossible to imagine. But let's try. Because understanding what we avoided helps us appreciate just how extraordinary our actual journey has been. Without fire, humans remain forever prisoners of their biology. Those massive jaw muscles we talked about, they never shrink. Our ancestors spend their entire evolutionary history grinding away at raw food for 6 hours every day, their skulls remaining thick and heavy to anchor the enormous chewing apparatus they need to survive. Their brains, starved of the extra calories that cooking would have provided, plateau at around 650 cubic centimeters, roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's brain. Large enough for basic tool use, simple communication, even rudimentary social cooperation, but never developing the explosive intelligence that would eventually send us to the moon. Language remains basic, a collection of grunts, gestures, and simple warning calls. Complex grammar never develops because there's no leisure time around protective fires for the kind of extended social interaction that builds sophisticated communication. Stories don't exist. Art doesn't emerge. Music never progresses beyond rhythmic grunting. The social groups remain small, maybe 20 or 30 individuals at most. That's the maximum that can huddle together effectively for warmth during those terrifying fireless nights. Larger groups would be impossible to coordinate without the gathering spaces that fires create. And they'd generate too much noise to avoid attracting predators in the darkness. Think about what this means for cultural development. Without firelit gatherings, knowledge dies with each individual. A brilliant toolmaker might develop a slightly better spear design, but without the extended social interaction that fire enables, that innovation vanishes when they die. Each generation starts essentially from scratch. There's no cumulative culture, no building on previous discoveries, no technological progress. For millions of years, human ancestors remained trapped in an endless cycle of basic survival, never developing beyond the level of any other intelligent animal. But here's where this alternate timeline gets really fascinating. Earth itself takes a completely different path. Without human fire management, the planet's forests grow denser and wilder than they ever were in our timeline. Lightning-sparked wildfires rage unchecked for months, sometimes years, burning across entire continents with no intelligent species capable of creating fire breaks or controlled burns. These massive conflagrations pump enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, creating climate patterns unlike anything in our world's history. Ice ages might be shorter and less severe due to the increased greenhouse gases. Or conversely, the massive ash clouds from continental-scale fires might block enough sunlight to trigger extended cooling periods. The wildlife populations develop differently too. Without human hunting pressure, remember, without fire-hardened spears, humans can't effectively hunt large game. Megafauna never goes extinct. Mammoths still roam the northern tundra. Giant ground sloths lumber through South American forests. Saber-toothed cats and cave bears remain apex predators throughout their former ranges, and something else starts to happen. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the ecological niche that humans never filled, the intelligent, adaptable, tool-using species, begins attracting other candidates, maybe elephants with their remarkable intelligence, complex social structures, and already impressive tool use. Start down the path towards something like civilization. Their long lifespans and powerful memories could enable a kind of cultural transmission that develops over centuries rather than decades. Picture elephant engineers using their trunks to manipulate massive logs and stones, building structures that take advantage of their incredible strength. Elephant artists creating massive landscape sculptures that can only be fully appreciated from the air. Elephant philosophers contemplating existence with minds that remember not just their own experiences, but detailed stories passed down through matriarchal lines for hundreds of years, or perhaps octopi, freed from their tragically short lifespans by evolutionary pressures in this alternate Earth, developed the first truly aquatic civilization. Their incredible intelligence and problem-solving abilities, combined with 8 manipulator arms that make human hands look clumsy by comparison, could lead to underwater cities of living coral, shaped by cephalopod architects. Imagine octopus libraries, where knowledge is stored, not in books, but in color pattern. Languages that shift and change across the walls like living murals. Octopus workshops where master craftsmen use their chromatophore skin to create tools that are both functional and beautiful, changing color and pattern to indicate their purpose. The corvids, ravens, crows, and their relatives might develop aerial civilizations in the tall forests that human fire never cleared. Their already impressive intelligence, combined with the kind of cultural transmission we see in real crow communities, could evolve into something like flying cities connected by invisible highways of shared knowledge and tradition. But here's what's most likely in this fireless timeline. No single species achieves the kind of dominance that humans did in our world. Instead, Earth becomes a planet of many intelligences, each adapted to their particular environment, each developing their own forms of culture and communication, but none able to make the leap to true technology without fire's transformative power. The elephants build impressive structures but never develop metallurgy. The octopi create beautiful art but never harness energy beyond their own muscle power. The corvids develop complex social systems but never escape the limitations of biological materials. It's a world of intelligent animals but not a world of technological civilization. And strangest of all, it might be a more stable world than the one we actually created. Without humans burning fossil fuels, there's no climate crisis. Without industrial agriculture, ecosystems remain in balance. Without nuclear weapons, there's no threat of global annihilation. The various intelligent species might conflict over resources, but they lack the technology to threaten the entire planet. It's a gentler world in many ways, but also a smaller one. No one ever looks up at the stars and wonders what's out there. No one develops the mathematics to understand how the universe works. No one creates art that explores the deepest questions of existence or music that can move listeners to tears. There's intelligence, but no consciousness that questions its own existence. There's society, but no philosophy. There's survival, but no transcendence. Most importantly, there's no fire. The force that transforms matter from one state to another, that releases the energy locked in chemical bonds, that makes possible everything from cooking food to powering rockets, remains forever wild and uncontrolled. Lightning still strikes. Volcanoes still erupt. Friction still creates sparks. But no conscious mind ever looks at these phenomena and thinks, I can use this. I can control this. I can make this serve my purposes. It's a world that never learns to transform raw materials into new possibilities. Where stone remains stone, metal stays locked in ore. And the incredible potential energy stored in fossil fuels lies forever untapped beneath the earth. And perhaps most tragically, it's a world that never develops the tools to leave Earth itself. No matter how intelligent the elephants or octopi or corvids become, without fire's power to forge metals and propel rockets, they remain forever bound to this single planet. When the next asteroid comes, and asteroids always come eventually, they have no way to deflect it, no backup plan, no possibility of preserving their intelligence and culture beyond Earth's atmosphere. All the intelligence, all the beauty, all the consciousness that evolved over millions of years, gone in a single cosmic impact, with no possibility of renewal or continuation elsewhere in the universe. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? How much of what we consider inevitable about intelligence and progress actually depends on that one crucial decision made by our ancestor in Africa 1.5 million years ago. Fire didn't just change human history. It may have been the key that unlocked the universe itself for conscious exploration. Without it, intelligence might evolve, but consciousness capable of understanding and transcending its origins might never emerge at all. Thank goodness our ancestor was brave enough, or curious enough, or cold enough to reach toward the flame instead of running away from it. Because that single choice opened up possibilities that no other species in this fireless alternate world ever discovers. But we did discover them, and we're still discovering them today. Right now, as you're listening to this, something extraordinary is happening in the countryside of southern France. Deep underground, in a facility called ITER, scientists from 35 nations are building what might be the most important machine in human history. They're trying to capture the fire of the stars themselves. I'm talking about nuclear fusion, the same process that powers our sun, that lights up the cosmos, that creates the very elements that make up our bodies. And if they succeed, if they can make it work here on Earth, it will represent the next great leap in humanity's relationship with fire. Think about this for a moment. Our ancestors learned to steal fire from lightning strikes. We learned to create fire through friction. We harnessed fire to smelt metals and power steam engines. We split atoms to release the fire locked inside matter itself. And now we're trying to recreate the nuclear furnaces that burn in the hearts of stars. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Inside ITER, hydrogen will be heated to temperatures of 100 million degrees Celsius. That's 6 times hotter than the core of the sun. At those temperatures, matter doesn't just burn, it becomes plasma, a state so energetic that atoms themselves break apart and fuse together, releasing enormous amounts of energy. But here's the mind-blowing part. If this works, if we can control stellar fire here on Earth, a single glass of seawater will contain enough fusion fuel to power an entire house for a year. The hydrogen in our oceans could provide clean energy for millions of years. No carbon emissions, no radioactive waste that lasts for millennia, no risk of meltdowns or explosions. Just the clean, abundant fire of creation itself, tamed and put to work for human civilization. Can you imagine what our ancestors would think if they could see us now? That first human who reached toward flame in an African cave, learning to control wildfire through careful feeding and protection. Now their descendants are building machines to contain temperatures that exist nowhere else in the solar system except inside the sun itself. It's the ultimate expression of that original impulse, the refusal to accept that fire must remain wild and uncontrolled. The determination to understand, to master, to make the forces of nature serve human needs. But fusion represents more than just another energy source. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about fire itself. For 200,000 years, human fire has been about combustion, breaking chemical bonds, combining elements, releasing energy through destruction and transformation. Fusion fire is different. It's about creation, about building heavier elements from lighter ones, about accessing the fundamental forces that assembled the universe itself. We're not just using fire anymore. We're making the kind of fire that makes stars shine. And yet, even as we reach for this cosmic fire, we're also discovering that the next revolution might involve moving beyond traditional fire entirely. Quantum computers operate at temperatures approaching absolute zero, the complete opposite of fire. Instead of using heat and combustion to process information, they harness the weird physics of subatomic particles to solve problems that would take conventional computers millions of years. Solar panels convert sunlight directly into electricity without any combustion at all. Wind turbines capture the kinetic energy of moving air. Hydroelectric plants harness the flow of water. We're learning to work with natural forces without necessarily burning things to release their energy. But perhaps the most profound revolution happening right now isn't technological at all. It's philosophical. For the first time in human history, we're truly reckoning with fire's shadow side, the same force that lifted us from the darkness, that enabled civilization, that sent us to the moon and built our modern world, is now threatening our planet through climate change. The carbon dioxide from millions of years of burning fossil fuels is warming our atmosphere faster than Earth's systems can adapt. Our challenge isn't finding new fire, it's learning to master the fire we already have. We need to prove we're wise enough to control our tools instead of being controlled by them. This isn't the first time fire has presented humanity with existential challenges. When we learned to smelt metals, we had to figure out how to prevent the toxic fumes from poisoning us. When we discovered gunpowder, we had to learn to live with weapons that could kill from a distance. When we split the atom, we had to confront the possibility of nuclear war. Each time, we've had to grow up as a species. We've had to develop not just the technical knowledge to control fire, but the wisdom to use it responsibly. Climate change represents our latest graduation exam. Can we harness solar energy without destroying ecosystems? Can we build wind farms without harming wildlife? Can we develop fusion power without creating new risks we haven't anticipated? Can we, in other words, prove that the child who first reached toward flame has truly grown up? The early signs are encouraging. Renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels in most parts of the world. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Carbon capture technologies are removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we're seeing the possibility of economic growth without increased carbon emissions. But the real revolution might be happening in how we think about fire itself. Instead of seeing it as something to exploit without limits, we're learning to see it as something to steward. Instead of burning everything we can find, we're learning to choose carefully what we burn and when and how. We're developing what you might call fire wisdom, the deep, understanding that power and responsibility must go hand in hand, and this wisdom is opening up possibilities that our ancestors could never have imagined. Precision medicine that targets diseases at the cellular level, artificial intelligence that can process information faster than any human brain, space telescopes that can see billions of years into the past, genetic engineering that could eliminate hereditary diseases. All of these technologies depend on our mastery of fire in its many forms, the controlled energy that powers our computers, the precise heat that manufactures microchips, the propulsion systems that launch satellites into orbit. We're still fire creatures, just as we were 1 million years ago in that African cave. But now, our fire includes the electromagnetic spectrum, nuclear forces, quantum mechanics, and the fundamental interactions that govern reality itself. Somewhere out there, perhaps, another species is just beginning their own journey with fire. Maybe on a planet orbiting a distant star, some curious creature is making that same choice our ancestor made, reaching toward flame instead of running from it. If so, they're about to embark on an incredible adventure. They're about to discover that fire isn't just about warmth and light and protection from predators. It's about transformation, possibility, and the gradual mastery of the forces that shape the universe. They're about to learn that fire is the key that unlocks not just technology, but consciousness itself, the ability to understand and shape reality instead of just surviving within it. And perhaps, millions of years from now, their descendants will build their own ITER, attempting to harness the fires of their own star. Perhaps they'll face their own climate crisis and have to learn their own fire wisdom. Perhaps they'll eventually venture out into space, carrying their mastery of fire to other worlds, spreading consciousness and intelligence throughout the galaxy. The question isn't whether we'll discover the next great breakthrough. The question is whether we'll be ready for it, whether we'll have the wisdom to use it well, whether we'll prove ourselves worthy inheritors of that first brave soul who looked at fire and decided to make it humanity's friend instead of its enemy, because the story isn't over. Fire is still transforming us, still opening new possibilities, still carrying us toward destinations we can barely imagine. That first spark, struck in an African cave 1 million years ago, is still burning. It burns in every power plant, every computer, every rocket engine, every star in the sky. It burns in the fusion reactions happening inside our bodies, in the electrical impulses racing through our brains, in the chemical bonds that hold our DNA together. We are fire's children, and fire's future is our future. The flame that first warmed our ancestors' hands now reaches toward the stars themselves, carrying the light of consciousness into the vast darkness of space. And the most amazing part: we're just getting started.